Today's guest is John Vervaeke, an award-winning lecturer from the University of Toronto in the departments of psychology, cognitive science, and Buddhist psychology. Many of you may know him from his very popular YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. We're going to delve into the topic of wisdom. How does it come about, and what are we to do about the loss of processes in modern society for scaffolding young people into adulthood? So I suppose we should start by asking, what is the meaning crisis?
This is always a challenging question for me since I took 50 hours to talk about it and have written several articles on it. The meaning crisis can be thought about in this way. Our ability to make sense of the environment is a very complex, dynamical process. And those processes that make us adaptively intelligent inevitably make us subject to forms of self-deception. And that self-deceptive behavior becomes self-destructive because it actually distorts or warps the way in which we are trying to adaptively fit ourselves to our environment. And across cultures, across history, people have come up with solutions to this very tricky problem. You don't want to shut off that adaptive machinery because you need it, but you want to ameliorate how it causes self-deception. So I sometimes say something like this: intelligence is what you use to solve your problems, and wisdom is what you need in order to address the self-deception that arises as you're using your intelligence. And so cultures have created ecologies of practices for trying to ameliorate the self-deceptive, self-destructive aspects and enhance the sense of connectedness to oneself, to each other, and to the world. And they've called that wisdom. Now, one way of understanding the meaning crisis is we are creating in the West a culture in which wisdom is more and more needed because we confront more and more attempts to manipulate, distort, mislead us, more avenues in which we can engage in self-deception. Just think about how social media magnifies everything I'm saying right now.
Yeah.
So we've never needed more wisdom, and yet we are nevertheless more at a loss for it. So I will regularly ask my students, where do you go for information? They'll hold up their phones, right? Where do you go for knowledge? Maybe the university science. Where do you go for wisdom? And then there's a deafening silence from they don't know. There is nowhere to go. And this is because of many sort of historical reasons having to do with the decline of religion, which was one of the places where we honed the cultivation of wisdom as distinct from science and the accrual of knowledge. It has to do with a lot of other social factors, and it has to do especially with the fact that we have overemphasized one kind of knowing, propositional knowing, at the expense of other kinds of knowing that are more properly where that meaning making, that self-correcting sense of connectedness is to be found. So that's one way of understanding what the meaning crisis is. Another way is you can ask, what are some of the symptoms showing up in the culture, etc. But that's a good way of initially getting at it. We've never needed it more, and we are never more starved for it at exactly the same time.
Very well said. What is the relationship between insight and wisdom?
So I think insight is one of the central capacities of wisdom because it reflects that ability to engage in a correction of our sense-making abilities. So here's a core problem you face. It's sort of the central problem of what you might call my scientific work, which is the amount of information that you have to process. The amount of information in your environment, and social media exacerbates this, is actually combinatorially explosive. It's overwhelming. Think of all the things you could pay attention to right now. And then think of all the things you could remember. You could think about aardvarks. You could think about the American Civil War. You can think of, is there any connection between aardvarks and the American Civil War, right? And so there's all the ways you can tap your memory and connect things. There's all the possibilities you can consider, right? There's all the sequences of behavior you consider. Like I could move these two fingers, I could move this one, then this one, I could make these sounds come out of my face hole, I could do that while point. And yet, here's what's astonishing about you, and what we can't give to artificial intelligence yet, is you are somehow ignoring most of all of the information you could attend to, most of the information in your memory, most of the possibilities, most of the things you could say, most of the things you could do, and you're holding a conversation with me. And that's astonishing. Now, what that means is you have to frame your cognition like the frames of my glasses, right? And you have to ignore what's outside the frame, and your frame is telling you what's salient, what's relevant, what's obvious, what you should pay attention to. That's enormously adaptive. But here's the price you pay for it. Sometimes the information you're ignoring is actually the information you need, right?
Yeah.
So insight is when you realize that you've misframed a problem, you've misframed a situation, and you've considered the wrong things are salient and relevant. You know, when you get that aha moment and you say, oh, I was thinking she was aggressive, but she's actually afraid. I wasn't paying attention to the right things. I should have, oh, right, now I get it. Now I see into insight. Now I see into the situation. I'm more connected to the reality. So insight, that is a moment that shows that tremendous capacity to reframe so we can zero in on relevant situations. I think it's a fundamental feature of wise people that they can come into very messy, complex situations, and we're struggling, and they reframe them and they zero in on the relevant information, and they fit themselves to it readily so that they can resolve what needs to happen. And we go, wow, how did you do that? That was wise. That's why we can, right? We can say, you know, that person doesn't have a lot of scientific knowledge, but they're very wise. We go, yeah, that makes sense. That person's not very artistic, but man, are they wise? You go, yeah. But we don't say things like, well, that person's not very insightful, but they're wise. We go, no, that doesn't work. They need to be insightful if they're wise. They need to be able to see through potentially distorting, right, misleading, self-deceptive illusion into what's real. So in that sense, I think there's a deep connection between insight and wisdom. I think there's a lot more to wisdom to insight, but I think insight reveals that important ability to evolve our connectedness, to correct it so that we overcome the way in which we have been disconnected from ourselves, from others, or from the world.
Yeah, great. If we imagine a 19-year-old man senses his inadequacies in relation to fathering and contributing to society as a person, beyond the contributions made through the technical side of employment, what is it that forms the process of his maturing into a good father and a community man? Which of the following fall? Is it A, his own individual biology as his brain develops inevitably over time? B, a process he voluntarily puts himself through? C, a process that his community or society puts him through? Or D, either all of the above or something else?
I say the degree to which the person matures in virtue is what is going to turn them into a good father, good husband, good friend, good lover. Now that process involves, I think, all three of the domains you mentioned. There's certainly a biological domain. Frontal lobes have to grow and develop, and they're not done when you're 19, so that's important to know. Is that an important part? Yes. Is society doing things to help maturation? Yes. I didn't generate English for myself, neither did you. Society gives me this tremendous capacity through language. Society gave me literacy. I didn't give it to myself. You didn't give it to yourself. In fact, it doesn't make any sense to say that. So society provides us with tremendous tools for improving our cognitive power, our cognitive grasp. But I think in the end, the linchpin is the degree to which the individual aspires to virtue. And what do I mean by virtue? I mean a integration of belief, of skill and habit, of states of mind, and of traits of character, so that they are organized such that the person acts as wisely in the appropriate situation. For example, I think kindness is a way of being wise in this situation. Being honest is the way of being wise in this situation. And I think that project of aspiration, of aspiring to being more virtuous and wise, is something that requires both tremendous support, but also tremendous internalization. That 19-year-old really needs to find wiser individuals that they can internalize. There's a very good phrase from the ancient world: as the child is to the adult is to the sage. What a child does is a child internalizes an adult perspective on the child. The child learns to imitate what an adult would think about what the child is doing. And the child does that until they can do it for themselves. And then they get the reflective capacity to stand back and look at their own perspective. And that's how they get their metacognitive ability. In a similar way, a young adult can aspire to be wiser by internalizing wise figures, sages, either living or dead, that represent an aspirational challenge to them, while also modeling to them what a virtuous life looks like. And so, in addition to the biological growth and all the social psychotechnologies that are provided to us by our culture, and all the support we get from social networks, I think the individuals have to engage in the project of cultivating virtues by cultivating the integration of the requisite beliefs, skills, states of mind, and traits of character. And they need to solidify that and identify with it by internalizing sages. I live by trying to internalize, Socrates and Siddhartha and Spinoza.
Yeah, cool. What is the relationship between ritual and play?
A deep and profound one. This comes from some work done in response to the brilliant work of L.A. Paul, Transformative Experience, and Agnes Keller, Aspiration. L.A. Paul makes it very clear that many of the big decisions, the one that will require the most wisdom in our life, are ones that involve what she calls transformative experience. Just to briefly explain, she gives a sort of thought experiment. She says, your friends come to you and they offer to make you a vampire. They give you really undeniable proof that they can do this. Well, should you do it? The problem you face is you may have propositional knowledge about vampires, and maybe you have a full few skills. Maybe you can lurk well in the shadows, but you don't know what it's like to be a vampire. You don't know what it's like to have their perspective on the world. You don't have that perspectival knowing. And you also don't know what it's like to be a vampire in the sense of having the identity of a vampire, what you value and how you prioritize things. And so here's the problem you face. You don't know what it's going to be like until you've made the change. And so should you do it? Well, if you don't do it, you don't know what you're missing. But if you do it, you don't know what you're going to lose. You're ignorant both ways. Now, you say, well, what do I care about that? That's vampires. Well, her point is whenever you're making these kinds of decisions that I'm going to list, you're in that same situation, having a child. Having a child is going to change you in ways you don't know. Being a child does not prepare you for being a parent. You know all kinds of propositions, and your culture may give you some stuff, but you don't know what it's going to be like until you get there. Enter into a romantic relationship with somebody. It's going to change you. You're going to become a different person. You're going to see things differently. You're going to be a different person. So should you do it? Well. So that's a sort of as far as Laurie takes it, L.A. Paul. But I proposed to Laurie, and she took it very seriously. Well, this is what people do. Let's do the example of having a child. They don't have a child. What they do is they get a dog, and they name it with a human name, and they give it its own bed in its room, and they take pictures of it, and they give it toys. So what they do is they find a symbolic place that's in between those two worlds. They haven't fully left not having a child because all they have is a dog, but they're kind of getting a taste of what it's like to have the responsibility. So they're in this symbolic place where they're playing, they're doing serious play. So they get a taste of what that identity and world might be like without fully leaving, right? Or prematurely committing. They don't leave the world. They may decide, I don't want a kid. Now, when you do that with a dog, and you say, I don't want the dog anymore, and you give it away, people sort of look, oh, okay. You can't do that with a kid, right? There's all kinds of social, no way, you don't do that, right? All right. And so people engage in serious play. And you can see this is how intelligent mammals, in fact, do this. They move into this liminal place where they're doing serious play. Psychotherapy is serious play between worlds, right? Between ways of being and seeing that you don't yet have, but you propositionally think you should have, etc. Now, ritual is an important kind of serious play in order to try and afford people making those kinds of transitions. It's a kind of serious play that involves what I call imaginal augmentation. So imagination, we have one word for two different phenomena. One is when I say to you, like, picture a sailboat, or it sails up or down. This is forming mental pictures that take you away from your perception of reality. But if you watch a child seriously playing and they tie a blanket around themselves and pick up a stick and they say, I'm Zorro, they're not picturing something. They're actually seriously playing the way I'm talking about. And what they're doing is they're using imagination to enhance their perception. They're enhancing their perception of their identity. They're enhancing their perception of skills they possess or lack, because that imaginally augmented perception can afford them making the transition to particular role models. They're not going to probably become Zorro, but they might figure out, oh, this is what it's like to be more heroic. This is what it's like. And so when you have ritual, what you're often doing is you're imaginally augmenting serious play in order to get people, in order to afford and provoke people into serious transformation. So that's what I'd say is the relationship between ritual and play. Ritual is imaginally augmented serious play for the purpose of important transformative experience.
Good one. Is the flow state relevant to the process of maturation of wisdom?
Wow. I think so, but good question. The flow state is very good evidence for the procedural and perspectival and participatory, that sense of connectedness, that sense of being very well fitted to one's environment. That's a predominant feature of the flow state. And the flow state is like an ongoing insight cascade, like, aha, and you're discovering more and more about your world. And it's often engaged in as serious play. You're often in the flow state because you're doing things that are for their own sake, like playing music, sparring with somebody, etc. Rock climbing. Rock climbing is absurd unless it's generating the flow state. So the flow state really makes people aware of the value of that dynamic adaptive connectedness and of the insightful improvement of it. So much so that you can predict people's sense of well-being by asking them how many flow states or flow experiences they've had. And this is therefore indirectly predictive of how meaningful they find their lives. Now, the trick of it is, that's why I was sort of hesitating in answering. You want flow state that transfers if you're cultivating wisdom. So there are some, please hear that word, some video games that video games are really good at inducing the flow state, but they induce a flow state that doesn't transfer out of the virtual world onto the real world. Right? And so what you get is you get flow within the virtual world in such a way that flow in the real world diminishes.
Yeah.
But in comparison, when I started, and I'm still a Tai Chi player, so way back when in 1991, in the before time, before cell phones, right? Before most of what we call the internet. I started Tai Chi, and you get into the flow state within Tai Chi. But what was happening, and other people were pointing this out to me, is people were noticing that I was becoming more flexible I was in graduate school, in my conversation. I was more balanced in my conception. I was more flowing in my dialogic. See, what had happened is what I was training in doing the forms was percolating through my psyche and permeating through my life. It was transferred. Now, part of that was the really well worked out embodied nature of the flow state in Tai Chi Chuan, but also this philosophical framework around it. So there's this embodiment and scaffolding that helps to transfer the flow state out of its original environment into your life and your psyche as a whole. So I would propose to you, when the flow state is properly supported in that fashion, it can be very important to the cultivation of wisdom. But when it's the polar opposite, when it's locking you into specific situations in an addictive fashion, then it can be very detrimental to wisdom.
Sure. What have you got happening currently, and where can listeners follow you?
So, I mean, going onto my YouTube channel is probably the best thing for many people. I mean, you can check out, stuff I'm publishing in academic journals if you want, but I imagine for most people, start with Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But there's other things on offer on my channel. There's a full online course on meditation, contemplation, the cultivation of wisdom. There's a whole bunch of cognitive science shows where I'm in dialogue with other people on various topics about consciousness, the nature of the self, etc. And then there's another playlist, Voices with Vervaeke, where I'm doing something like this, where I'm dialoguing with people who are interested in and contributing to, reflecting upon the meaning crisis, wisdom, the nature of meaning. And what's happening most cutting edge for me right now is next week, I'm going to start filming for my next big series called After Socrates, which will be significantly different, both in content and format, than Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So keep your eye open for that.
Sounds good.
Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is coming out in a book. We are going through the final editing, and book one, we broke the series up.
Is that going to be a direct translation of the audio, or is it?
No, it's not a direct. I mean, it's faithful, but there's improvement. There's extra references, citation. There's a 40-page glossary of all the technical terms. There's extra figures. Christopher Mastropietro is doing a lot right now to tweak the language so it works better as a book. So there's going to be lots there on offer that isn't in the series. There's another book that Chris and I are working out on dialectic into dialogos, and Christopher Mastropietro and I and Guy Senstock regularly do the weekend workshops on dialectic into dialogos. We're going to be having another one this October. So if you're interested in learning the practices and not just the language, right, but actually engaging in the kind of practices that can afford transformation, there's lots on offer for you.
Awesome. John Vervaeke, thank you for coming on the podcast.